Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. This is the Ecosphere channel. My name is Bulos, and in this video we're going to be looking at an essay by Gaverick Matheny titled Utilitarianism and Animals, which explains the utilitarian ethic and then shows how it can be applied to some issues in animal ethics. It seems that Matheny wrote this essay specifically to serve as the introduction to Peter Singer's book In Defense of Animals, The Second Wave. So in presenting various fundamental concepts, this essay greatly represents Peter Singer's utilitarian ethic, and it serves as a good introduction to some basic ethics as it explains important terminology and arguments for a non-academic audience. But before we start exploring the essay, I do have a couple things to mention. Firstly, I did find a PDF version of this essay online, and so I will leave a link to this essay in the description, despite not knowing if I have the permission to do so. I am also not summarizing this essay word for word. What I say here should not be considered a direct representation of his work, and if you want his words and argumentation exactly, it'd be much more efficient for you to go ahead and read his essay for yourself. Again, link in the description. But if you aren't looking to commit the time to neither reading the essay nor watching this whole video, I have compiled cliff notes of what I'm about to discuss, shown on your screen now. And as a disclaimer before we start, I am an undergraduate student studying environmental science. I'm not an expert in the field of ethics, but I do hope this discussion is fair and useful nevertheless. Since we're talking about animal ethics, it's inevitable that our discussion is centered around the ongoing abuses done to animals by humans. This essay begins with statistics in order to help us grasp the scale of the problem. Matheny gives us specific numbers for how many animals are killed each year for fur harvesting, laboratory testing, and animal agriculture. His data is quite outdated as it's 20 years ago and only represents North America and Europe. But I'll mention the numbers he provides anyway. Starting with fur farms, in 2001 within North America and Europe, 30 million animals were killed for their fur. In animal laboratory testing, the death toll requires some guesswork because often researchers are not really required to keep track of how many animals they kill. Yet the number Matheny provides is between 50 and 100 million animals killed in laboratories in 2001 in North America and Europe. And I did research some more accurate, up-to-date data for the death toll of animal agriculture at a global scale. The website ourworldandata.org has conveniently compiled numbers in order to estimate how many of different animals were killed for meat in 2021. Of course, I will leave a link to this page in the description below so you can check out this data for yourself. But perhaps it would be a good exercise to try and guess how many cows, pigs, sheep, chickens are raised and killed for food every year. These numbers, we're not just talking about millions of animals. The death toll is on the scale of billions of animals killed each year for meat. Over 70 billion chickens are killed each year in this world for their meat. Over 70 billion killed each year, which works out to over 200 million chickens killed every day. Averaged out every second, that's 2,000 chickens are killed, with most of them being raised under absolutely torturous conditions their entire lives for the sake of our meat consumption. 70 billion every year. And so chickens make up the vast majority of land animals that are killed for their meat, but moving on to other animals, 1.4 billion pigs. 1.4 billion pigs were killed in 2021 for their meat. Over 600 million sheep, over 600 million turkeys, over 500 million goats, over 330 million cows. And all of these numbers represent real animals that are being killed right now. And of course, the death toll is still rising as the demand for meat increases. There are a few things to note though. One, these numbers do not include dairy, aka deaths involved in milk and egg production. 2, I don't think these numbers include animals that have died before the point of slaughter due to disease, trauma, whatever it be. And 3, this data only includes the most popular meat animals, and so many species are left unaccounted for. It's particularly difficult to estimate how many different sea animals are killed every year, and so fish and crustaceans are not represented in this data. And I should at least acknowledge that even more sea creatures are killed every year than land animals. From understanding how many animals are killed each year for food, there are 2 points that must be acknowledged. The first point is that for the vast majority of these billions of animals, they suffered terribly their entire lives. Industrial animal agriculture has forced animals into worse and worse conditions for the sake of efficient production. The second point is that meat and dairy are not necessary for a healthy diet. Because of this, all the suffering in animal agriculture is completely unavoidable and unnecessary in supporting healthy diets for humans. I think both of these points require some extra investigation because they're just so important to understand in animal ethics, and so I highly recommend that you check out the resources I've left in the description of this video for yourself. 1, to reveal the abuses that exist within animal agriculture, and 2, to debate if meat and dairy is actually necessary for a healthy diet. I understand that not everyone thinks it's possible to eat fully plant-based, but for the sake of this conversation, we can compromise with recognizing it's at least possible to raise animals ethically for eggs or milk, or even ethically slaughter animals for meat, but the current state of industrial animal agriculture is absolutely not necessary. Again, I recommend that you check out the resources I've linked in the description below for yourself, especially to learn about the state of industrial animal agriculture. But getting back into Matheny's essay, I think he begins the essay by presenting these large numbers in order to put into perspective what we're talking about. In animal ethics, we're not merely just discussing animals. We're here to discuss the absolute scale of suffering that exists in our societies caused by our societies. These are not theoretical discussions about how we should treat animals. These are actual discussions about how we as human societies are currently treating animals and what needs to be done in order to stop that abuse. Out of the various ethical theories that exist, Gaverick Matheny and Peter Singer argue for utilitarianism as a theory that is able to inform the proper moral consideration of animals, and therefore we have this essay. Central to Matheny's explanation of utilitarianism is the idea that I cannot claim that my interests are any more important than yours. Our interests are equal. In a moral context, this word interest refers to something that we care about. So, for examples, most significantly, I have an interest in health, in satisfying my hunger. I'm also interested in having fun or spending time with family. Further, I have an interest in not being murdered or in avoiding pain. So interest basically refers to what is important to us as individuals. Even though these interests are important to me, basic morals tells us that mine are not objectively any more important than yours. Thus, the core tenet is that everyone's interests deserve equal consideration. So according to this principle of equal consideration of interests, when we make decisions, we should be considering the interests of everyone affected by our actions and consider their interests just as we would consider our own. In considering everyone's interests, however, there is accounting that must be done in order to make sure that we support as many interests as possible, maximizing total interest fulfillment. Described by Matheny, I should sum up the interests of all the parties affected by my possible actions and choose the action that results in the greatest net satisfaction of interests. This is called the utilitarian rule, the max sum rule, represented mathematically as a summation. Here is the equation displayed on Wikipedia for utilitarian rule. Without needing to be so specific, a summation basically means that we are adding together a bunch of values. So in the utilitarian theory, we add together all the individuals who are affected by an action. An individual who has more of their interests fulfilled, who is better off by a certain course of action, receives a positive number, and an individual who has more of their interests frustrated receives a negative number, each of which is scaled proportionally to the amount of interest fulfillment or frustration. Thus, when we add up these values for everyone involved, a large positive number means that for this specific course of action, results in the fulfillment of many interests, whereas a large negative number means that interests were greatly frustrated by this course of action. So within utilitarianism, what we're trying to do is maximize the sum value of all individuals. We want a big positive number representing great interest fulfillment. So accordingly, we should choose the scenario that results in the greatest positive number. This job of accounting for everyone's interests and then adding them all up is utilitarianism, maximizing well-being for everyone involved and minimizing harm for everyone involved, the max sum principle. Personally, I think that this max sum principle is fairly obvious, as the well-being of everyone is the ultimate goal, or we should at least strive to maximize well-being and to minimize suffering for everybody. The utilitarian theory puts this principle into explicit terms and, in theory, would tell us exactly what to do accordingly. One of the ways Matheny argues for utilitarianism is by explaining 4 core properties within the ethic that we can all intuitively agree are ethically good. Firstly, utilitarianism is universalist. It takes into account everybody, regardless of whatever morally irrelevant characteristics, meaning it does not discriminate based on nationality, race, gender, species, rationality, etc. Where there is an interest, it should be considered. Secondly, utilitarianism is welfarist, meaning that moral good is directly based on the welfare of individuals. We have defined welfare by referring to the idea of interests, either fulfilling them or frustrating them, but we can also use the terms pleasure and pain to get the same general concept. Utilitarianism is also a consequentialist theory, as it is based in the consequences of our actions. We should make decisions carefully due to their consequences. And finally, it's aggregative, as it seeks the greatest net satisfaction of interests for everyone involved. The theory should do its aggregative mathematics as previously described with a summation, seeing which action will result in the least amount of harm and the greatest amount of satisfaction according to the interest, intensity, duration, and number. We can see how some of these values of utilitarianism may be relevant for forming an animal ethic. A universalist consideration of interests makes sure that we consider animals, despite them not belonging to our current moral sphere of human society. The welfarist basis ensures that animal suffering is directly targeted as it pertains to the conditions of animal abuse. And as mentioned in the beginning of the essay, the aggregative property is quite significant as animal ethics pertains to billions of individuals yearly. These properties of utilitarianism help us make decisions in some ethical predicaments, yielding fairly reasonable arguments as to, for example, how someone ought to spend an extra $1,000. Should the money be spent on a new TV or better given to charity? Our aggregative utilitarianism will probably determine that we ought to give the money to charity, since that money is of better use there, fulfilling more interests of a greater cause than just wanting a new television set. Of a similar monetary example, how much should we be taxing people in order to redistribute financial support to the less privileged? To what degree is this warranted, taking away from the rich and giving to the poor, knowing that money has more utility in the hands of the poor in being able to serve their interests? The theory of utilitarianism directly manages these problems, balancing the interests of various parties, which will prove useful in informing the trade-off of human and animal interests. If you're interested in learning more about utilitarianism, I recommend that you look at some of the Wikipedia pages here for further reading. In transitioning to applying these utilitarian values to animal ethics, Matheny emphasizes that the theory is quite progressive as it's been applied throughout history. He states that followers of utilitarianism have strongly opposed slavery, have strongly supported women's right to vote. They have supported social democratic institutions like public education and healthcare. And more recently, utilitarians have been strong proponents of charity as to help poor and sick people. That being said, utilitarianism still leads us to moral views that many of us do not already accept. Prominent among these are the moral views regarding non-human animals. As per the principle of equal consideration of interests, we ought to consider the interests of anyone as they exist. But a big problem in animal ethics is the debate as to which species actually have interests. For example, people will assume that inanimate objects like rocks do not feel pain in the way in which you and I feel pain, and thus it's not morally bad to break a rock in half. Alternatively, we ought not break a human in half because we do feel pain. In this way, we've made moral judgments that we can go around harming rocks, but we can't go around harming people, based on the rock's lack of sentience and the fact of human sentience. Humans can feel pain, we are conscious, sentient, and can experience positive or negative feelings. Here we see that sentience is a sufficient condition for having interests. Rocks do not have interests. Humans do have interests as conscious beings, in avoiding pain, in achieving happiness, whatever those interests may be. Relevantly for animal ethics, how do we know what is sentient? Which species feel pain and which don't? This has been a central problem in animal ethics, as the claimed lack of sentience of animals has ethically excused animal abuse, supposing that animals can't feel and thus they can't truly suffer. People suppose that they are what's called philosophical zombies, lacking the conscious feelings that you and I experience. And honestly, this debate of animal sentience is so vast and complex that I can't give much nuance to that discussion here, but for now we'll just have to stay on track and contain ourselves to the points that Matheny develops as to why he thinks animals are sentient. Matheny begins his argument by mentioning what's called the problem of other minds. This problem states that we never actually know the experiences of anyone other than ourselves. Theoretically, other humans may be mindless zombies, lacking any conscious experience. There's no way in which we can test that theory via direct observation of their sentience. The reason why we do assume that other humans are sentient, though, is because we share the same biological structures. If my brain is sentient, then surely your brain is sentient too, because our physical brain structures are nearly identical. Again, we will make the assumption that rocks are not sentient because rocks have no brains. We're not testing for sentience, we're just intuiting based on the rock's physiology. In this, since we at least know ourselves to be sentient, human physiology is a benchmark for what is able to produce sentience, and then we can extrapolate based on physical similarities with other species. The more similar something is to human physiology, the more confident we are that there is sentience. For non-human animals, we know that the brains of mammals, birds, reptiles, fish contain the same core parts that humans do, relevantly for sensing pain and pleasure. And surely just having these brain parts does not ensure that they actually do experience sentience, but finding these similarities in physiology is the best evidence we've got, and the similarities are unquestionable. It becomes more difficult to guess when the biological structures of an organism are less similar to that of a human. So for example, invertebrates, like insects, are just built differently, and so people are a whole lot less sure of their sentience as compared to, say, mammals. But despite being physically different, however, some invertebrates, like octopi, show great awareness of their surroundings and are quite intelligent, which may be clues as to their sentience. Based on our personal experiences with dogs and cats as pets, the average person probably won't deny that at least some animals are certainly capable of feeling pain. Even if our observations and common sense intuition are not sufficient for actually proving they are sentient, it definitely seems that dogs are sentient based on how they act with such intent and emotion. And with dogs and cats being biologically similar to other animals, it is thus also reasonable to assume that cows, pigs, and chickens are also sentient. If we do believe that our pets are sentient, then we must also assume that farm animals are sentient and consider their interests equally as to how we consider the interests of our pets. But despite these arguments of sentience being extremely relevant and historically significant in debating animal ethics, Matheny purports that a lack of sentience is not actually the main justification for the abuse of animals. People don't justify animal abuse by arguing that they don't feel anything, as it's widely agreed that they probably do. But rather, the justification is that sentience is not a sufficient condition for moral consideration. People argue that we ought to consider the interests of those who are sufficiently rational or intelligent, or able to participate in complex language or reciprocate moral agreements. Primarily, these arguments are concerning as how can the lack of intelligence or language logically justify ignoring pain? And secondly, there are inconsistencies with how these principles are applied to different humans. Yet most plainly, some argue that the relevant moral determinant is membership to the species Homo sapien. They're just not human. And with a sharp delineation, all humans exist within the moral in-group, whereas animals by default are in the out-group. Belonging to a group is not morally relevant. What's relevant is sentience, feeling pain and having interests. As per the principle of equal consideration of interests, we are wrong to consider the interests of those of the out-group as lesser than ours, although we may be predisposed to do so because of some ingrained biological or cultural bias. If sentience is a sufficient condition for equal moral consideration, then we should be considering the interests of other races, genders, or species equally as to our own. Yet of course, there are many ways in which humans are not equally considering the interests of non-humans. Matheny goes on to list agriculture, product testing, medical and scientific research, entertainment, hunting and fishing, clothing manufacturing, owning pets, etc., etc. Matheny first discusses the use of animals in agriculture. He notes, however, that words are unable to fully express the conditions that animals are put through in factory farms. So I can try to describe in words what occurs. I can describe how these individuals suffer for months, years, for their entire lives in just terrible conditions. Quote, confined in a cage so restrictive that turning around or freely stretching limbs is difficult if not impossible. Live in his own excrement, be castrated or have her teeth, tail, or toes sliced off without anesthesia. It's really just scratching the surface of the absolutely terrifying conditions of factory farms. The thing is though, just hearing these words doesn't actually allow us to understand the abuse. Central for a lot of people's ethical development is seeing videos of the abuse, watching animals as they suffer for the sake of our consumption. Witnessing the event over words is necessary in order to understand. As I've said before, there are resources in the description of this video so you guys can see for yourself, and I highly encourage you to do so. Although it's not really easy to watch, I'm so very glad that I have paid attention and I've allowed myself to understand. I do not in any way regret allowing myself to, and so of course I think that you should be paying attention as well. But regarding all this suffering, Matheny works to show our society's double standard of animal abuse. He compares the way in which we treat our own pets with how we treat farmed animals. Sick dogs and cats are euthanized. We decide to put them down so that they don't needlessly suffer at the end of their lives. At the same time, however, factory farm animals often suffer their entire lives without a timely release of death. I mean, imagining our own pet dog or cat under those conditions, imagining our pets being farmed this way for their meat, surely any pet owner would rather have their pet euthanized than have to experience any of the suffering that farm animals are forced into. And it's relevant to note that animals like pigs are actually smarter than dogs, and thus probably more aware of their suffering than our own pets would be. If we support dogs and cats, then why are we not also supporting other animals, possibly of greater sentience and in much worse conditions? And so Matheny calls this societal moral hypocrisy a bizarre contradiction, that people can care so much about the species of dogs and cats, yet don't hold these same standards for animals in agriculture, laboratories, in the wild, etc. It's very difficult to justify this treatment of farm animals, and few people seriously try to, particularly because people can be perfectly healthy without eating meat. Matheny calls out to vegetarianism specifically. He says that vegetarians are, on average, healthier than the average eat-meater, and thus the consumption of meat is really just out of people's desire to eat it. According to the utilitarian theory, the consumption of meat would thus only be justified if the joy someone gets of eating meat is greater than the harms caused to the animal. Within industrial animal agriculture, the answer is obvious. The abuse is just that significant, where our interests in eating their factory farm meat are way overridden by their interests in avoiding such torturous conditions. In Matheny's words, we would probably conclude that our substantial interest in not being raised in a factory farm and slaughtered is stronger than our trivial interest in eating a chicken instead of chickpeas. Although Matheny promotes vegetarianism, which does allow for the consumption of non-meat animal products, he is still specific in admonishing our current consumption of eggs and milk. Equal consideration of interests require that we abstain at a minimum from eating factory farm products, particularly poultry and eggs, products that seem to cause the most pain per unit of food. I'd say that Matheny still specifies vegetarianism due to the ability to source ethically farmed dairy cows or hens, but he doesn't really elaborate on what specifically we should do. Just in general, Matheny promotes a plant-based diet as means for us to reduce consumptive demand of animals, and thus the industrial production of animals. Ideally, we should not consume products from any animal that we believe is sentient. This is the least we can do to have any real regard for the pain felt by other animals. The thing is, though, eating animals is a habit for most of us, and, like other habits, can be challenging to break. But millions of people have made the switch to a vegetarian diet and, as a result, have enjoyed better health and a clearer conscience. The section on animal agriculture ends with a few statistics in order to further put things into perspective. So once again, Matheny mentions the scale of how many animals are raised and killed for meat each year under the most deplorable conditions. Keep in mind, 70 billion chickens, 1.4 billion pigs, 600 million sheep, etc., etc. He claims our consumption of animal flesh, eggs, and milk probably causes more pain than any other action for which each of us is responsible. The average North American or European eats somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 factory farm animals in their lifetime. If we ended our discussion here and all became vegans, we would effectively abolish 99% of the present use of animals. Again, talking only about North America and Europe, Matheny reports that around 50 to 100 million animals are killed every year in laboratories. In the United States, it's not even legally required to keep track of how many rats, mice, and birds are killed. And these animals are very commonly used in research, and because of this, there's a lot of variation in the estimates as to how many animals are actually killed within laboratories each year. A significant use of animals in laboratories is for the sake of testing new consumer or household personal care products. And most of the time, these new consumer products are only superficially different from existing products. So let's say, for example, there's a new type of shampoo being developed that helps with split ends or something. But before it can be sold to the public, it needs to be placed into some animal's eye to see if it causes tissue damage. Now, using the utilitarian theory, we'll probably find that the suffering endured by the test subjects is of greater significance than our more trivial interest in hairstyling, particularly because other types of shampoos already have been developed. And as Matheny says, how many different formulations of laundry detergent or shampoo does the world need? And it's pretty straightforward that efficiently producing consumer products is a poor reason for animal experimentation. As opposed to the use of animals in consumer product testing, however, the discussion of animal use in medicine is less straightforward ethically, as it provides potentially non-trivial benefits to human beings and other animals, allowing new drugs and medical treatments to be developed time effectively. Here, animals are harmed for the sake of improving human health, and so it's easier to imagine how improvements to human medicine could serve the interests of many sick people, potentially outweighing the test subject's interests in avoiding pain. So the question is, does human benefit outweigh the required suffering? If it does, then basic utilitarian theory will tell us that for a specific instance of research, testing on animals is justified. But Matheny finds it hard to believe that this is the case for most instances of animal testing. Quote, "It's difficult to imagine that the pain experienced by 100 million animals each year is averting an equivalent amount of pain. In most cases, the suffering endured leads to no improvement to human health at all, being fruitless studies. But even when it does, Matheny introduces a test to mentally check our prejudices. The thought experiment involves replacing animal test subjects with orphaned human infants. Common test subjects in labs, like dogs and primates, are arguably more aware of their bodies and of pain than babies are. Thus, they would experience pain more severely than a human infant. And so recognizing that babies probably feel less pain less consciously than many adult animals, it would actually be better to experiment on infants due to their lack of sentience, there being less suffering involved. So would we be willing to use babies in the place of animals since they feel less pain? If we refuse to test on human infants, but we will test on those other animals, then we are making moral judgments based on the fact that babies are Homo sapiens, rather than actually taking into consideration the amount of suffering involved. This moral judgment would be considered speciesist and is not morally consistent with the utilitarian framework of equal consideration of interests. People may want to reject utilitarianism as it makes arguments like these about testing on human infants, but the relevant takeaway is not that we should switch to testing on babies. I think the relevant argument is that to be morally consistent with our valuing of suffering, we should usually reject animal experimentation. Wild animals are often not taken into consideration when discussing animal ethics, but Matheny decides to write this final section of the essay in their consideration. Usually, if people are to talk about wild animal ethics, it's in relation to sport hunting or fishing, and these often fall under the category of environmental protection. Animal ethics rather spends most of its resources focusing on industrial animal agriculture and laboratories, as they are very deliberate systems that produce a lot of harm, more so than what a wild animal would experience just living in nature. Primarily, Matheny discusses how countries in the global north, such as the United States, people consume a large amount of resources. And really, any resource demand is going to be putting strain on ecological systems and the individuals within them. But for wealthy lifestyles in particular, the scale of consumption is definitely morally significant, as it requires large-scale messing with ecological systems. We, rich people, consume a tremendous amount of energy, water, land, timber, minerals, and other resources, which all require extraction, processing, product production, distribution, byproduct disposal, end-of-life waste management, etc., etc. Although again, all of this is usually critiqued from an ecological, environmental perspective, we also understand ecological harms to be realized on the individual level. So the use of resources and subsequent polluting of ecological systems is not just ecologically destructive, but it kills animals, either directly or by taking away their livelihood, and prevents wild animals from existing any further into the future. Since we interpret harm to wild animals and harm to ecological systems as generally equivalent, environmentalism can give inspiration as how we can reduce animal suffering. For examples, directly tackling consumptive demand, action may include taking public transit, eating a plant-based diet, having smaller families, minimizing product consumption, aka not buying things besides our necessities. But then also the conversation extends to any action which can be taken to prevent infringing on wild animal spaces and their livelihoods. With viewing this opposition between consumer demand and ecological integrity, which is equated with wild animal welfare, we have to balance our interests as consumptive humans fairly with animals' interests in ecological integrity. I think examples of land usage most clearly demonstrate this point through the direct conversion of habitat into an unsuitable environment, aka habitat loss. For the sake of fulfilling consumptive demand, whether that be agriculture, housing developments, industrial usage, resource extraction, whatever it be, a habitat space is destroyed, taking away land, resources, and stability from wild animals. To be more specific with our example, I've seen the account of a solar farm technician who has had to remove tortoises from their nests and take them away in order to make space for a solar energy farm. In this way, we're directly balancing our interest in solar energy with the livelihoods of animals that live on the land, and they must be disrupted in order to make way for our society's development. Through the utilitarian ethic, do our interests as consumers outweigh the interests of wild animals from losing that habitat? Actually going through this example and determining what we should do may be a lot of work, especially as it pertains to ecological crisis avoidance. So I'm unable to give nuance to that discussion here, but I do hope to develop this idea in a future video of how sustainable development ought to be considered through a utilitarian ethic. And so if you're interested in that, I highly recommend that you subscribe so as not to miss it. Matheny remarks that there are remarkably few contemporary defenses for the treatment of animals discussed, where we abuse farm animals, laboratory animals, wild animals in these ways. So although Matheny is presenting a utilitarian argument for the better treatment of animals, he also provides a list of further readings to show that other ethical frameworks and arguments are still very convincing about these very same issues. This suggests that overcoming these abuses is not difficult because of any philosophical uncertainty, but rather it's because people are deeply ignorant to existing animal abuse and because it's very difficult to change deeply ingrained habits. So rather than any real ethical theory used to justify the difference in treatment of pet animals and non-pet animals, Matheny thinks that this reason is our proximity to pets, be that physical, emotional, or cultural proximity. Physically, people interact with pets, but we never see, let alone interact with food animals or lab animals, causing us to insufficiently consider their interests. Emotionally, people are connected with dogs, cats, and horses due to their relationship as pets. And culturally, there are traditions of either companionship with or supremacy over certain species, on which we base our morals. This is why people, at least in the United States, strongly take action against the abuse of dogs, cats, and horses, but are disconnected from the abuse of other animals. But most people are really just not aware of the mistreatment that occurs and the scale at which it occurs. And when people are shown videos and made aware, however, they are appalled by the abuse, not because they've adopted any ethical theory, but because they have a common sense position that these animals do feel pain, and thus it is common sense that we ought to prevent their pain and suffering wherever possible. But even devout moral philosophers are prone to pressures of habit, and many people who denounce the consumption of animals are still eating meat, regardless of their strong moral convictions. Because of this, I think we conclude that theories like utilitarianism greatly support animal ethics, but theory alone does not give us incentive to care or act on animal ethics. Getting people to take animals into consideration requires more than ethics. It requires some physical, emotional, cultural connection with animal suffering that is just currently lacking, where people can see an animal and then know that their well-being is significant and deserving of real consideration despite our differences. Hi everyone! I'd just like to say thank you really quickly for watching the video through to the end. I do hope this video has stimulated some reflection or has taught you something new. Here are the cliff notes once again in case you'd like to review what we've discussed today. Since the video did cover so many different things, it may be useful for solidifying into memory some of the big takeaways. I would also love to see any comments on this video of your thoughts and feelings. If there would be any relevant points that I left out or rebuttals that you would like to make, I would really appreciate you voicing those down below so as to improve my own perspective, but then also to generate useful discussion. Thank you all again, and have a good one.